I was sitting in a quiet corner of a think tank library recently, watching two researchers argue over a map of South Asia. One of them pointed to a tiny dot in the Indian Ocean and said, "That's where the silence ends." He wasn't talking about the waves, he was talking about the new nuclear-armed submarines slipping into those waters, the final piece of a naval triad that changes the game for everyone. For decades, we've lived with a specific kind of comfort, believing in something called the liberal international order, a fancy term for the idea that global rules and shared trade would keep the world from blowing itself up. We like to think of non-proliferation as a public good, a selfless effort by great powers to keep us safe. But if you step outside the halls of Washington and talk to experts in Delhi or Islamabad, that cozy narrative starts to feel like conceptual jello. To them, the order wasn't built on shared values. It was built on coercion, hypocrisy, and a very sharp sword held to the throat of anyone who didn't fall in line. We see this manifested in the historical application of sanctions, the selective enforcement of international law, and the insistence that only one model of political and economic development is valid. This has bred resentment, creating a fertile ground for alternative visions of global order. Now we're entering a second nuclear age, where the old rules are melting away. It's not just about two superpowers anymore. It's about short-range cruise missiles and something called MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, missile warheads that can split into several different warheads, each hitting a different target hundreds of miles apart. This technology radically changes the calculation for stability because it drastically raises the payoff for a first strike and multiplies the threat capacity of a single missile. Add to this a sudden, frantic rush to the sea and you have maximum volatility. The most chilling part, we are building these world-ending machines in a vacuum of communication. There's a question hanging over the global community like a shadow. Can there be order without trust? We are currently watching a high-stakes poker game where every player is convinced the other has an ace up their sleeve, and the dealer, the United States, is increasingly being blamed for breaking the table. While Washington points fingers at Russia and China, a growing chorus of global voices is suggesting that the call is coming from inside the House. Today, we're going to look past the official press releases and dive into the messy, distrustful reality of our nuclear future, exploring why the next decade and a half might be the most volatile era humanity has ever faced. Okay, so let's unpack all of that. Our mission for this deep dive is to really analyze the core tensions that are bubbling up in this geopolitical moment. We're looking at, I think, a fundamental ideological challenge to the existing liberal international order, the one that's always been very procedural, very focused on institutions. And this challenge is coming primarily through a new security and development architecture from the East.
Right. And it's not just about abstract ideas or moving pieces on a chessboard. What we're seeing is a real transition to a new kind of security framework, one that's much more focused on things like civilizational resilience and just pure institutional efficacy. Does it work? Does it get results?
Exactly. And the fascinating part is how that high-level strategy connects directly to the hard power reality on the ground.
That's the thread we'll be pulling on. We're going to go from understanding this big ideological proposition, China's comprehensive vision for a new world order, all the way down to its physical manifestation. I'm talking about things like the expansion of naval strategic triads in the Indian Ocean. I mean, that is a true expression of technological dominance through sheer industrial output.
And we absolutely have to connect those strategic concepts to the reality of economic stability. Because at the end of the day, none of this happens in a vacuum. We'll get into the critical role of state capacity, specifically this developmental state model, in underpinning this new global competition. It's all about fostering stability through industrial output and collective economic security.
It's a completely integrated vision. You have ideology, economics, and hard power, all working in concert, reinforcing each other.
So to get started, we need to be on the same page. What do we even mean when we say world order? It can feel like a very abstract concept.
It can be, but a veteran American diplomat once boiled it down to something very practical. He said it's about the nature of just arrangements and the distribution of power. Mm-hmm. The entire system really is anchored by two interlocking components, legitimacy and power. You need both.
Okay, let's talk about power first. In this new era of competition, how should we be thinking about it? It feels like it's more than just counting warheads or looking at GDP charts now.
It's much more than that. Power, in this context, is simply the ability of a state to achieve its objectives, even if others oppose it. It's the means to deter an attack, compel a rival to change their policy, persuade an ally, or coerce an opponent.
For the established powers, that's traditionally meant military superiority, backed by the dollar's dominance.
Exactly. But what we're seeing now is a new definition of power emerging. It's increasingly measured by raw state capacity. It's the ability to execute massive, long-term infrastructure projects, the ability to create technological champions from scratch, to manage these vast, resilient supply chains, this material efficacy, the ability to get stuff done. That's what enforces restraint when the formal rules start to break down.
And what about the other side of that coin, legitimacy? That seems much trickier to measure than, say, a trade surplus or a defense budget. It's the softer side of power.
It is. But it's just as crucial. Legitimacy is the popular acceptance that the ideas, the rules, the institutions, and the actors themselves are, for lack of a better word, righteous. And you don't generate that with force. You generate it by establishing shared norms and rules and then popularizing them through a constant contest of narratives and discourse.
So states are always trying to get others to see their actions as legitimate.
Perpetually. And when a critical mass of actors, especially in the global south, accepts a new set of rules, let's say about development finance or non-interference, you get what's called a norm cascade. And that cascade can actually redefine what the entire international community considers appropriate behavior.
That brings us right back to this foundational geopolitical shift. The narrative we're hearing from the Chinese leadership is that they believe the balance of power, both geopolitical and geoeconomic, is fundamentally shifting eastward. And they don't see this as a temporary blip. They see it as a structural change.
Correct. They view this profound and admittedly turbulent change as presenting significant strategic opportunities for their own national rejuvenation. They're also very clear-eyed about the challenges, like what they perceive as external attempts to contain or block their rise, and that context really fuels their strategic ambition to actively shape the international environment to be more conducive to their model, rather than just reacting to the old LIO framework.
And this ambition, it translates directly into becoming what our sources call an aggressive norm entrepreneur. It's not enough to just be a powerful player in the game. You have to try and rewrite the rule book.
That's it, exactly. Norm entrepreneur is any state that sets out to change the existing normative context of the order. But what makes China's approach aggressive is that it's injecting massive substance, huge resources, and a very deep narrative coherence into its conceptual frameworks. So instead of just standing on the sidelines critiquing the current system, Beijing is defining itself as a proactive state that's willing to underwrite and shape global governance through its own alternative institutions.
Which brings us to the core of this alternative proposition: the Community of Common Destiny for Mankind, or CCDM. We've heard this phrase since around 2007, but its recent formalization gives it serious institutional weight.
CCDM is the key. It's the overarching normative shift. It presents a vision of global governance where countries are meant to rise together, rather than engaging in what they see as zero-sum competition. And it's not just a slogan. It's supported by 4 crucial pillars, or initiatives, that provide the concrete operational framework. You have the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, then the Global Security Initiative, GSI, the Global Development Initiative, GDI, and the Global Civilization Initiative, GCI.
These are the mechanisms for that result-oriented engagement you mentioned.
Precisely.
Okay, let's start with the economic pillar, because that seems to address the most common grievances we hear from developing nations. That's the Global Development Initiative, the GDI, proposed in 2021.
Right, the GDI links directly to the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, which gives it immediate global recognition. But, and this is critical, it has a very different political approach. It calls for placing development high on the global macro policy agenda and fostering global development partnerships that are more equal and balanced.
So the appeal is that it's focused on results, on things you can see and measure quickly, like physical infrastructure and economic growth.
That's the fundamental appeal. It's about doing things now.
How does that differ from, say, the traditional development model from the World Bank or the IMF?
The key difference is in conditionality and speed. The traditional Washington consensus model often ties financing to a whole host of requirements: structural reforms, democratization, stringent environmental and governance standards. Many developing nations view these conditions as, well, neo-colonial interference, or even as rules designed to slow down their own industrial climb.
Whereas the GDI, which is backed by Chinese policy banks, and the AIIB focuses on delivering credit and infrastructure quickly.
And without the political strings attached. That's the queer of it.
That seems incredibly compelling from a strategic standpoint. I mean, if you're a leader struggling to deliver tangible progress to your people, A project that offers a new port or a power grid with minimal political meddling is going to be very, very attractive.
Absolutely. And the metrics bear that out. Nearly 100 countries, and specifically 70 countries, have already joined the GDI's group of friends at the UN. And the projects are incredibly practical. They cover things like poverty reduction, food security, climate change resilience, industrialization, the digital economy, and development finance. The objective is laser-focused on expanding the development space for everyone involved, and that generates immense political capital and legitimacy for the framework itself.
Okay, so let's move from economic development to security. This brings us to the Global Security Initiative, or GSI. And this is framed as the antidote to what Beijing calls the Cold War mentality and bloc confrontation.
Yes, the GSI is kitched on the concept of universal, or what they call indivisible, security. The argument is that humanity is an indivisible security community.
Meaning no country can achieve security at the expense of others.
Exactly. It stresses the need for taking the legitimate security concerns of all countries seriously and building a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture. The whole narrative is designed to be a very sharp contrast with things like NATO expansion or the U.S. system of security alliances, which GSI proponents frame as inherently confrontational, bloc-to-bloc politics.
But isn't there a bit of a contradiction there, calling GSI an antidote to Cold War thinking, when it seems to be, in effect, securitizing trade and building an alternative power bloc based on shared economic interests?
That is the critical question, isn't it? While the GSI's concept paper leans very heavily on the language of the UN Charter for Collective Security, giving it this multilateral veneer, the practical implementation certainly involves strengthening partnerships and deepening security ties among states that are aligned with the broader CCDM vision.
So that's where the ideology meets the hard geopolitical reality of building influence.
That's where it meets.
So what does the GSI look like in practice? What are some tangible examples beyond the concept papers?
There are two key areas to watch. First, you have this major expansion of Chinese military and security diplomacy across the developing world. For instance, they've made a significant commitment to train 5,000 security professionals from developing countries. That's a huge investment in building both capacity and policy alignment at the same time.
And the second area?
The second, and a very celebrated success, was Beijing's role in brokering the détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023.
Right. The Iran-Saudi rapprochement was a huge geopolitical moment. Why was that specifically highlighted as an example of GSI in practice?
Because it showed China's ability and its willingness to play a proactive, stabilizing role in a critical global hotspot, a region where, frankly, traditional Western diplomacy had struggled to achieve any meaningful breakthroughs for years. It demonstrated that GSI isn't just a rhetorical platform. It's a diplomatic toolkit that can achieve tangible security results. It did this by facilitating dialogue and leveraging the economic interdependence that China has built to foster political stability. It effectively bypassed the traditional conflict fault lines and showed there might be an alternative path to resolution.
And under the GSI, there's also this purposeful move toward the securitization of economic engagement.
This might be the most important long-term strategic element. The GSI explicitly includes goals like maintaining stable supply and industrial chains, safeguarding food and energy security, and actively countering unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. This mirrors the policy discourse on resilience that you hear in the West, but the GSI frames it as a measure for universal security against what they term politically motivated economic warfare. It's an open acknowledgement that economic independence and resilience are fundamental prerequisites for national security in the 21st century.
Okay, that brings us to the newest pillar, the Global Civilization Initiative, or GCI, launched in 2023. This seems to address the core challenge of global distrust and ideological divergence head-on.
It does. The GCI argues that the diversity of human civilization is a basic feature of the world and a source of human progress. The core idea is that this diversity must be respected through dialogue and learning. So the initiative really targets this global trust deficit by promoting a non-judgmental approach to different cultural and political systems. The implicit goal of the GCI is to influence global patterns of thought and engender certain mindset changes, specifically moving away from the idea that certain political models are universally superior to others.
It sounds a bit more nebulous than the others, more of a cultural framework than a security or economic one. How does something like that gain traction?
It gains traction through discourse and, crucially, through resources. Money is injected into projects for cultural heritage preservation, education, and people-to-people connectivity. But the real normative shift it's proposing is about governance and human rights. And that's where it directly challenges the traditional LIO framework.
Let's focus on that fundamental challenge. What is it?
The GCI proposes that there is no one-size-fits-all model for promoting and protecting human rights. Instead, it argues that rights must be based on historical, specific, and practical contexts of a country. And here's the key part. It stresses that the rights to subsistence and development are the basic human rights of paramount importance.
So it's a state-centric lens, placing state stability and the collective interests of the community over individual interests.
Precisely. And that is a fundamental challenge to decades of liberal international progress, which has always prioritized civil and political individual rights above all else.
So on one hand, we have the sophisticated, capability-based ideological architecture designed to create legitimacy and a new global order. But here's the tension. If the CCDM is supposed to foster a community, why is the world's most acute security challenge in South Asia descending into even deeper distrust? Let's shift our focus there to the growing strategic distrust among the nuclear-armed states, China, India, and Pakistan. The volatility is palpable.
That region is intensely crisis-prone. You have unresolved territorial disputes that are perpetually simmering, and this is coupled with rapid, continuous military modernization by all three of these nuclear-armed states. But the most dangerous ingredient, by far, is the pervasive strategic distrust. The top-level diplomatic dialogues, track one, are infrequent, and when they do happen, they often just devolve into mutual blaming. There's a serious, dangerous lack of mutual understanding about what the other side intends to do.
And this volatility is all interconnected. It forms what's been called a strategic chain that runs right through the region and then extends globally.
The sources are very clear that this nuclear dynamic is triangular and it's tightly coupled. India is reacting to Pakistan's nuclear missile programs, but of course China is not indifferent to India's developments, particularly the expansion of its naval capabilities into the Indian Ocean. And this regional dynamic, in turn, influences global nuclear thinking in capitals like Washington and Moscow. This strategic chain remains unbroken.
Which means an escalation between any two of them could elevate the risk of nuclear use, either intentional or accidental developing out of what starts as a conventional crisis.
That's the fear.
What's truly terrifying is the breakdown in communication precisely when it matters most. The formal mechanisms for de-escalation, the hotlines, they're all there. But the reporting suggests they're basically dysfunctional in a real crisis.
The communication is severely limited, especially in the India-Pakistan dyad. The existing hotlines and formal mechanisms are rarely used, and when they are, the information that's shared is minimal and highly ambiguous.
Why? What's the core problem?
The core problem is psychological. It's rooted in this profound strategic distrust. Each side harbors a deep-seated fear that the other is using the communication channel not for de-escalation, but to mask malign intent, to delay a response, or to gain a tactical military advantage. This fear of deception essentially poisons the well. It makes it impossible to achieve mutual understanding at the very moment it's needed most to prevent a catastrophe.
So if you can't have traditional personal trust between leaders in the heat of a crisis, the focus has to shift. It has to be about mutual responsibility, about managing insecurity, which is where this concept of security dilemma sensibility, or SDS, comes in as a potential corrective.
SDS is a cognitive and institutional ability. It's the ability to step back and appreciate that your adversary's actions, like a military buildup or an increase in patrols, might actually be motivated by their own fear and insecurity rather than by some innate aggression.
So it's about seeing the situation from their perspective of fear.
Yes, and by exercising that sensibility, two nuclear adversaries who are both committed to de-escalation can recognize the shared nature of their insecurity. And in that shared fear, they can find a path forward. It's not about sympathizing with their worldview or agreeing with them. It's simply about recognizing mutual fear as a basis for agreement. And that creates the necessary space to de-escalate without forcing either side to resolve the core political dispute right then and there.
But how do you institutionalize something as abstract as recognizing mutual fear? It feels like that would require a whole new structure, which is why the proposal for a South Asian Standing Communications Secretariat, or SAS-CS, is so intriguing.
The SAS-CS would be a permanent, inclusive mechanism, and it's designed specifically to foster trusting relationships at the official working level. The colonels, the deputy directors, independent of the volatile personal trust, or lack thereof, that exists between the top political leaders.
So it insulates the process from political wins.
Exactly. If you look back, major confidence-building measures, or CDMs, like the ones in the Lahore Declaration, they only really succeeded when there was high-level personal trust between the leaders. As soon as the leaders change or tensions flare up, those CBMs often collapse. The SAS-CS is designed to embed the practice of SDS, this understanding of mutual insecurity within the permanent bureaucracies, ensuring that risk reduction practices can endure regardless of who is in power.
So you're creating working trust rather than personal trust. What would the day-to-day function of a secretariat like this even look like?
It would involve regular, low-stakes meetings. You'd have mid to senior level officials from the military, intelligence, and diplomatic corps of all three nations sitting in a room together. And they wouldn't be trying to solve Kashmir or argue about border disputes. They'd be focusing solely on technical discussions, things like standardizing terminology for missile launch notifications, defining what an ambiguous military maneuver looks like, or coordinating technical data on nuclear safety.
So the routine engagement in a non-political context builds the rapport.
It builds the rapport and the familiarity necessary for those same officials to actually trust the veracity of the information that's being shared during a high-stakes crisis.
Beyond that high-level diplomacy, the sources also really emphasize regenerating cultural and civil society involvement as a way to build mutual understanding not just at the bureaucratic level, but among the general populations.
This is a critical pathway. It involves reviving and regenerating historical instances of knowledge exchange that have atrophied. For example, there are specific proposals to restart journalistic exchanges, to encourage more balanced and less inflammatory reporting on both sides of a border, and educational programs like the Successful Exchange for Change for students. These things help foster the mutual understanding that's crucial for long-term risk reduction by countering the entrenched nationalistic narratives that just fuel suspicion.
We also saw a very creative proposal for a Women in Security Enterprise, or WISE group, as a way to kind of circumvent the usual political obstacles.
WISE is a suggestion for a dedicated multinational group, ideally including women from India, Pakistan, and potentially China, who all work professionally on security issues. Operating virtually, this group would aim to build connections and mutual understanding completely outside of the politically charged official diplomatic tracks.
And what's the strategic rationale there?
The core rationale is frankly strategic. A female-only track discussing sensitive security issues would likely cause less political suspicion and be less scrutinized by hardline elements in the respective governments than a mixed-gender format would be. And that allows for a more open, a less politically compromised dialogue on things like risk reduction methodologies.
So if landing big, comprehensive new agreements is just too difficult right now, focusing on the low-hanging fruit, updating or expanding existing agreements seems like a much more pragmatic step. What are the CBMs that need to be modernized immediately?
The focus has to be on updating the measures that have actually continued to work, despite all the increased distrust. And the most urgent update relates to missile technology. The existing 2012 agreement on pre-notification of ballistic missile testing must be extended to include notifications for cruise and hypersonic missile tests.
Why is that extension so critical right now? What's changed?
Cruise and hypersonic missiles introduce a critical ambiguity into the equation. Unlike ballistic missiles, which generally fly in predictable parabolic trajectories, these new weapons are highly maneuverable. They can be launched from air, sea, or land platforms. This makes it incredibly difficult for an adversary to determine if a launch is conventional or nuclear, or even what the intended target is. And that dramatically increases the risk of a catastrophic miscalculation. If the notification agreements don't cover these new, highly ambiguous platforms, the CDMs are essentially useless for managing the actual crisis dynamics of the 2020s.
And what about expanding the scope of the 1988 non-attack agreement?
The 1988 India-Pakistan Agreement on the prohibition of attack against nuclear installations is a vital bilateral CBM. It has survived decades of wars and tension. The suggestion is to explore extending this agreement to include China. Doing so would serve to bridge the Northeast Asia and South Asia security spheres on a non-weaponized, purely safety-focused issue.
So you're creating a diplomatic bridge on a controversial topic.
Exactly. Bringing China into CBMs, even on a highly specific safety matter, creates that bridge without forcing an immediate discussion on their nuclear weapons posture or force levels, which is politically impossible right now.
Now, let's move entirely outside of politically charged arms control. What technical cooperation pathways are available that could bypass this political gridlock by focusing on shared technical problems instead?
Focusing on non-political, technical issues like nuclear safety, security, and verification has a history of success. The proposal is to establish Regional Joint Centers of Excellence, or COEs. These would be for joint training in managing nuclear accidents caused by naturally occurring incidents like earthquakes or floods, which is a major concern given the seismic vulnerability of the region. This fosters the sharing of best practices and promotes technical interdependence. It makes safety a shared interest, not a zero-sum political game.
And tapping into the private sector, using advanced technology to build trust where politics has failed.
Yes, promoting tech-to-tech cooperation among private companies on areas like blockchain verification and fissile material tracking using something called zero-knowledge proof is highly innovative. This models the successful lab-to-lab cooperation that we saw historically between the US and the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War.
That concept, zero-knowledge proof, it sounds like something out of science fiction. Can you break down how that actually helps states verify compliance without giving away classified information?
Sure. Imagine you have a complex puzzle that represents your nation's fissile material stockpile. You need to prove to your adversary that you're not cheating, but you absolutely cannot show them the puzzle pieces themselves because that would reveal your proprietary design secrets. Zero-knowledge proof is a cryptographic method that allows one party to prove that a specific statement is true. For instance, I have exactly X amount of fissile material, without revealing any information beyond the validity of that statement itself.
That's incredibly powerful. So you can achieve verification without compromising your own national security secrets.
Precisely. In the context of fissile material tracking, this could allow private tech companies or international inspectorates to cryptographically verify the materials where it should be, using tamper-proof records like a blockchain, without ever needing access to sensitive military or proprietary data about warhead design or fuel production rights. It transforms a politically difficult inspection process into a technically verifiable exchange of data, and that makes it a highly constructive tool in the diplomatic toolbox.
The ultimate ambition here, which really encapsulates this need for inclusivity, is the idea of a new global nuclear risk reduction regime, or NRR.
The NRR is an ambitious concept for sure. It's meant to complement the existing Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT framework. The interesting part is that it would be driven by a coalition of states that includes India and Pakistan states currently outside the formal NPT structure. Given their status, they could act as the norm entrepreneurs for this initiative, reshaping the current regime to make it more inclusive and more focused on managing shared, accidental, or inadvertent escalation risks, which, frankly, the current NPT system is less well equipped to handle. Okay, now let's make the thematic link. All of this high-stakes security volatility has an immense and often overlooked economic toll. We're going to switch gears now and connect this security dynamic directly to its economic cost. Specifically, how chronic security concerns impose immense pressures on states, particularly those with limited financial buffers. The May 2025 conflict that was modeled served as a severe stress test for Pakistan. It revealed just how thin their foreign exchange reserves were and how severely constrained their fiscal space was. And you have to understand, financial markets are extremely sensitive to political risk. They don't just price temporary shocks, they price the probability of chronic instability. This unpredictability reinforces a high-risk perception, which raises risk premia, drastically increases borrowing costs, and narrows access to capital for a country that already has large debt rollover requirements. Security instability directly undermines economic credibility.
And the long-term consequence is a kind of structural fiscal pressure where defense spending becomes almost a fixed cost, and it just eats away at the country's development potential.
That's the classic crowding out effect. In regions with persistent security threats, military allocations are politically and institutionally very difficult to reverse once they've been increased. Security becomes the highest national priority, bar none. This creates a long-term expenditure bias that systematically crowds out critical development spending on things like education, health, and infrastructure, the very core drivers of long-term sustainable economic growth. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. Instability forces defense spending up, which then starves the development needed to create a robust, stable economy.
And on top of that, the trade opportunity cost, especially in South Asia, is just enormous.
It's massive. The absence of normalized regional trade, for instance, between India and Pakistan, limits economies of scale, and it dampens export competitiveness across the entire region. So instead of specializing and trading efficiently, countries end up building redundant supply chains, which increases costs, contributes to widening trade deficits, and ultimately puts pressure on currency stability. The World Bank estimates the regional trade potential is vast, but it remains politically inaccessible because of this security overhang.
We also see how internal governance challenges, things like corruption or unmanaged cross-border militancy, they compound these external pressures and further complicate economic stability.
Absolutely. Persistent internal issues weaken a country's international standing, and they severely complicate engagement with lenders and investors. Post-conflict environments only heighten these diplomatic and security pressures. It makes internal cohesion and credibility, addressing corruption, managing security threats firmly but diplomatically, more critical than ever for maintaining a stable economic profile and avoiding further sovereign risk.
So the economic strength needed to project global power and to finance the hard power race we were just discussing, it relies on a very specific governance model, one that actively steers the market toward national goals. And this brings us back to the developmental state model.
Right. The developmental state, sometimes called the hard state, was first conceptualized by Chalmers Johnson when he was studying Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MIT. It's characterized by an autonomous political power that is focused explicitly on economic development and state-led macroeconomic planning. This is where the state really takes charge of the long-term strategic direction of the entire economy.
This sounds fundamentally different from the US or Western regulatory state model, which typically focuses more on just setting the rules of the game and enforcing standards. It's completely different. A regulatory state primarily enforces standards and provides collective goods like legal infrastructure. A developmental state, however, rigidly guides the private sector. It intervenes to promote new industries. It aggressively pursues what we call industrial policies, rather than merely regulating existing economic activity. And these policies are typically guided by powerful, non-elected bureaucratic elites who are focused on long-term national and strategic interests, not the next election cycle. South Korea, with its Economic Planning Board, the EPB, after the Korean War, is probably the classic case study of this powerful interventionist model.
It is. South Korea emulated the MITI model perfectly. They established the EPB, which held immense power to control credit allocation and manipulate the market system. It organized private enterprises into these giant export-oriented conglomerates you've heard of called chaebols. The state strategically decided which sectors would get subsidized credit, favorable exchange rates, and protection from foreign competition. Economists at the time noted they were deliberately getting relative prices wrong by controlling inflation and exchange rates to ensure domestic production costs stayed low, which mobilized capital into the most promising export sectors.
And Thailand offers another powerful illustration of this, using tariffs and rules to demand domestic content and control from foreign corporations in a way that generates real national capacity.
Thailand's developmental policies in the mid-20th century focused heavily on import substitution. They imposed these extraordinarily high tariffs, sometimes reaching 80 to 150% on finished luxury goods like automobiles. It made importing them prohibitively expensive. But at the same time, they provided incentives for foreign auto industries to enter into joint ventures locally. And crucially, they enforced the 51% rule, demanding majority Thai control in key ventures to ensure that jobs and profits were retained and that technology transfer was guaranteed within the country. This required immense state strength to resist pressure from both multinational corporations and from wealthy domestic consumers who just wanted cheaper imported goods.
So fast forward to today. After the 2008 financial crisis, there seems to be a new global consensus, even in traditionally liberal economies, that the state should play a more proactive role. This revival of industrial policy is what's setting the stage for the current strategic competition between China and India.
The debate has shifted entirely. It is no longer if the state should intervene, but how to best conduct industrial policy. And this has resulted in two very distinct national strategies, both aimed at achieving manufacturing dominance. You have China's highly targeted vertical strategy, Made in China 2025, or MIC 2025. And then you have India's broader, more horizontal strategy, Make in India, or MII.
Let's start with MIC 2025. Its objectives are very explicit and strategic: to become a manufacturing superpower by dominating high-tech industries and achieving near self-sufficiency in key sectors. And the stated goal explicitly links manufacturing dominance to strengthening national security and becoming a world power.
And it is a highly selective, what we call a vertical policy. It targets only 10 high-tech sectors, things like new energy vehicles, NEVs, robotics, and next-generation IT. The focus is intensely on technological upgrading and indigenous innovation. So the state takes on a regulating role through very specific vertical instruments. massive R&D subsidies, preferential procurement rules for domestic firms, and strong support for state-owned enterprises, SOEs, as national champions.
Can you elaborate on the mechanics of a vertical instrument, like the dual credit system for cars? How does that demonstrate state capacity?
The dual credit system is a perfect example of state leverage. It mandates that any manufacturer operating in the Chinese market must meet two targets: a fuel consumption credit target for reducing emissions and a new energy vehicle credit target for selling EVs. Now, if a company, especially a foreign company like a traditional German automaker, fails to meet these EV sales targets, they are penalized. They're forced to buy credits from companies that do meet the targets, and those are almost exclusively domestic Chinese EV manufacturers.
So it's using market access as a weapon.
It's using the sheer size of the Chinese market as a geopolitical weapon. It strongly induces the vast growth of China's domestic NEV industry and forces global technology transfer simply through the price of market participation.
Okay, now India's MII strategy, on the other hand, aims to become the world's manufacturing hub by diversifying its economic base across a much broader range of 25 different industries.
MII reflects a more facilitating or horizontal role for the state. It focuses less on picking specific winners and more on improving the overall business environment for all sectors. This is best exemplified by the dramatic rise in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business ranking, where India jumped from 142nd in 2014 all the way to 77th in 2019. The instruments they use: infrastructure creation, FDI reforms, skill development, and these new production-linked incentives, PLI, which are offered across various sectors, are all aimed at removing general barriers to investment rather than narrowly selecting specific technologies for dominance. It's about being an attractive destination for global manufacturing, not necessarily about achieving indigenous technological supremacy in every single field.
But despite these very different approaches, China prioritizing technological supremacy through vertical means, India prioritizing attracting investment through horizontal facilitation, both strategies are still targeting high-value sectors, like the auto industry.
And that demonstrates the continued global recognition that a strong, strategically controlled manufacturing base is absolutely essential for both long-term economic development and, crucially, for hard power projection. Which brings us right back to the sea. The economic competition happening on the factory floor translates directly into the race for strategic military capabilities.
And that hard power projection is what dictates this next chapter of volatility. The sources we've looked at all emphasize that the Indian Ocean is the theater of decision in the 21st century.
It really is. The Indian Ocean serves as a massive economic choke point. It facilitates something like 80% of global seaborne oil trade, and it's the critical artery for China's westward trade, which is heavily dependent on the Strait of Malacca. Therefore, naval dominance in that ocean is not a luxury. It's about controlling the engine of global trade and supply chains, which is why we are seeing this massive military buildup.
And the force structure required to achieve that level of control is described as a manifestation of industrial worship and technological capability. This is the naval triad.
Naval dominance requires a combination of high-tech platforms. The first is the aircraft carrier. It creates this visible, dominating battle space, what's been called a moving cylinder of national sovereignty, that extends 400 nautical miles from the surface all the way up to the troposphere. Carriers are essential for peacetime power projection, for presence, and for projecting air superiority.
But the crucial final piece that really defines this new nuclear age in the region, and the reason that the silence ends, as that researcher said, is the nuclear-powered attack submarine, the SSN.
The SSN is the platform of stealth. It is just as important as the carrier. It's fitted with land attack cruise missiles and anti-ship missiles. And unlike the larger strategic ballistic missile subs, the SSBNs, the SSN is purely for attack and forward power projection. It is the only platform that can operate effectively and, more importantly, undetected in anti-access zones like the South China Sea or the expanding anti-access capability being developed off Pakistan's Makran coast.
So the SSN is what completes the naval triad. It provides that silent, undetectable, strategic deterrent force that ensures stability through maximum capability.
Yes. The shift from a perceived period of silence, where the deep ocean was seen as this neutral, empty space, to this full maritime capability structure is the ultimate demonstration of industrial power. It signifies technological dominance. It requires complex metallurgical capabilities, advanced reactor design, deep-sea engineering prowess. This massive investment in an SSN fleet signals that the geopolitical geopolitical competition is now fundamentally one of technological and industrial supremacy.
So given this environment of maximum volatility, we've got a fractured ideological order, acute regional security risks, a frantic hard power race. We have to consider the inherent resilience required to survive a potential second nuclear age. And this is where the Global Socio-Technological Resilience Index, or GSTRI, comes into play.
The GSTRI is a fascinating, if sobering, piece of research. It assesses a region's capacity for post-catastrophe recovery based only on stable physical and environmental characteristics. It completely ignores temporary sociopolitical factors like government structure or currency stability. It's a foundational assessment of long-term human viability.
So it strips away all the politics and just asks a simple question. Could people survive and rebuild here? What are the 5 non-negotiable systems the index measures to determine that resilience?
The index measures resilience across 5 critical material systems. You have climate suitability, which is long-term average temperature and precipitation stability. Then caloric suitability, so arable land and food potential. Development potential, which is access to essential resources like iron ore and coal. And finally, water scarcity and natural hazard frequency. This purely physical approach helps identify areas that could truly sustain and foster a recovery, regardless of whether a central government collapses or not.
And what did it find? Where are these global high-resilience hotspots clustered? And what makes a place like Washington, D.C. or Buenos Aires a hotspot?
The study identified 218 statistically significant high-resilience hotspots around the globe. The top 10 largest contiguous hotspots include the eastern U.S., the Pampas region of Argentina and Uruguay, Australia, and in China, both the North China Plain and the Sichuan Basin. They're considered hotspots because they exhibit this favorable cluster of physical characteristics. Temperate climates, historically reliable precipitation, extensive fertile agricultural land for caloric suitability, combined with low natural hazard frequency. Washington, D.C. is included not because of its politics, but simply because it sits within that eastern U.S. hotspot, which boasts abundant fresh water and a suitable climate for diverse agriculture.
And there's a specific theoretical resilience advantage noted for the Southern Hemisphere in a worst-case scenario. Why is that?
This relates directly to the climate effects of a nuclear war, the nuclear winter scenario. In an event like that, massive quantities of soot and particulate matter would be thrown into the atmosphere. But due to global atmospheric circulation patterns, these particles would primarily remain confined to the northern hemisphere. This means that the southern hemisphere would experience less drastic cooling and, critically, would have more stable growing seasons and less immediate radioactive fallout.
So regions like the Pampas or even smaller, more isolated hotspots down south.
Exactly. Therefore, minor hotspots located in the southern hemisphere, places like parts of Brazil, Tanzania, Zambia, they may actually serve as more effective refuges for human populations than the larger, more geopolitically exposed northern hotspots. They might score lower on resource extraction potential, but their theoretical climate stability post-catastrophe gives them a crucial survival advantage.
So what we've detailed today is really a world in transition. We've moved from the idea of a procedural liberal international order, which many came to judge as hypocritical and coercive, to these result-oriented, capability-based frameworks like GSI and GDI, models that prioritize state capacity and physical development over political conditionality.
And we established that this volatility is felt most acutely in South Asia. It's driven by a deep, pervasive distrust and a constant fear of deception in communication. We saw that managing this risk requires sophisticated technical CBMs like the proposed SAS-CS and zero-knowledge proof verification to build a system of shared responsibility in the absence of trust.
We then connected that instability to its immense economic cost, explaining how security pressures force a structural fiscal bias against long-term development spending. And then we explored the competitive governance model that's emerging, the developmental state, which uses aggressive industrial policy, like China's dual credit system and India's PLI schemes, to generate the industrial strength necessary for global power projection.
And that economic and industrial power manifests directly in the hard power race for maritime supremacy. The Indian Ocean is the theater of decision, and the completion of the naval triad, with the introduction of SSNs, marks the end of silence. It signals a new age of volatility where only the most technologically dominant and industrially capable states can truly compete.
And finally, we look past all the political competition and the technological arms race to the fundamental resilience of civilization itself, which may ultimately rest on the specific physical geography of those identified global hotspots. It's a sobering thought. The ultimate guarantor of survival might not be the rules we write, but the land we inhabit. We're seeing a world rapidly moving toward a capability-based rather than an ideology-based order, where effective state control over the economy is now seen as the primary source of both peace and power.